We do begin with tonight's big story and the tense, hotly anticipated primary playing out right now in New York. The polls are still open tonight for a little while longer as all eyes are on Congressman Jamaal Bowman, an outspoken progressive and member of the so-called Squad, as he tries to fend off a primary challenge from George Latimer, the more centrist Westchester County executive. Polls show Bowman behind by double digits in some cases. In headline after headline, they're asking if he's doomed, saying that Bowman might need a political miracle to prevent himself from becoming the first member of the Squad to be ousted by a primary challenger. Taking center stage in this race tonight, Bowman's frequent criticism of Israel. Latimer has done the opposite, praising Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's handling of the Israel-Hamas war. So can Bowman hold on to his seat? And what does this mean for the Democratic Party as a whole in this election year? And specifically, what does it mean for President Biden? Joining me now to break all of that down is ABC News political contributor and NPR White House correspondent Asma Khalid. Thank you so much for being here with me in the studio tonight.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I do want to start with Jamaal Bowman and kind of zooming out from this primary while also keeping our focus on this primary. If he's able to pull out an upset victory tonight, what does that mean for the Democratic Party? And certainly if he loses tonight, what does that mean for the Democratic Party in this election year? Is this something that they should watch, or is it a one-off and a fluke?
Yeah. So I would say two things. One is I think it's careful that we don't over-extrapolate the results from this race. And the reason I say that is that the New York 16th Congressional District has a very large percentage of Jewish voters. It is, I think, a district in particular where the Israel-Hamas war matters in a very distinct way, in a way that it perhaps might not translate as much in, you know, the Atlanta suburbs or the Detroit suburbs. Very different demographics. The other thing I will say, though, is that I think Jamaal Bowman, while being a member of the Squad, has faced struggles. I mean, many of us recall his incident where he was charged with a misdemeanor for pulling a fire alarm. So no doubt this...
The video.
Yes,
we
exactly.
Saw the video.
So I think no doubt this is about the Israel-Hamas war. There's been a lot of money poured into this race, but there are also distinct specific circumstances around Jamaal Bowman's
A lot of
race.
money poured in by pro-Israel lobbying groups. When we talk about the Israel-Hamas war in general for the Biden administration, you so often hear that the political calculus is on the progressive side of the aisle, and there are progressive Democrats who are upset with President Biden over his handling of the war. What have you heard from Democratic sources about how they're going to approach that come November?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Biden campaign, the White House, I would say broadly, doesn't seem to think that the Israel-Hamas war is a huge liability for them in the November elections. That being said, we've all repeatedly seen polling that shows a number of Democratic voters would like to see a ceasefire. They would like to see certain specific changes from President Biden. But, you know, Jay, I think that this predates the current conflict. And the reason I say this is going back to 2021, when there was previously some skirmishes between Israel and Hamas, I did reporting at that time on the push from some within the Democratic Party to shift what Ben Rhodes, Obama's former Deputy National Security Advisor, described to me as the shifting of the Overton window on the Israel unconditional support for Israel. And this has been a slow shift. I think some of it, we can talk about the reasons, certainly has been, I think, expedited because of what we've been seeing after October 7th. But look, I think these are divides and debates that the Democratic Party has been having for a number of years. They have been magnified because of the current conflict and some of the images we can all see on social media. That all being said, I will say time and again, what I hear from the Biden campaign is they do not expect this to be an overwhelming campaign issue.
That's interesting that those fissures have existed before this, and this is just exposing them more and deepening that rift. I do want to pivot, though, to the debate because you cover the White House. And this debate, we know that the former president is going to be on the attack. We know that Biden is right now at Camp David, huddling with advisors, some of whom you can imagine are trying to prepare him for that exact scenario. What do you know about what's going on there? And also, how does Biden handle this debate from what you've seen at the White House?
So I heard from a source who's been involved with debate planning and debate prep for Biden, saying that they anticipate and they see Trump running a quote, more disciplined operation. And the reason I think this is important is when you debate Donald Trump, you don't really know what version of him you might get. A lot of folks remember that first debate in 2020, chaotic, a lot of crosstalk. Trump was more disciplined. He I think, was more restrained in that second debate. debate. That, from my understanding, is what the Biden campaign is anticipating. That being said, I think there's a lot of unknowns, both in terms of policy, substance, style of how this all will transpire. Biden's a big homework guy, though, right? So he's been reading in on what Trump says and thinks, and Trump has been, prepping in a very different style.
And challenges in that a sitting president doesn't usually face a format like this until he's running for election.
He doesn't. And look, Biden is a man who, as president, has not done a whole bunch of press conferences. So he hasn't been on the receiving end of having to engage in really, I would say, succinct sound bites in a sort of combative format. Sure, he's given the State of the Union a few times, and that's what his campaign points to, is his performance during the State of the Union. I hear this from supporters of President Biden, but the State of the Union and a debate with punches and counterpunches, very different format.
Asma Khalid, we could do this all day. Thank you so much for your time on this Tuesday night. I do want to turn now to our big story panel, though, with all of this. Joining us is ABC News contributor and op-ed columnist for the Los Angeles Times, Elsie Granderson, ABC News contributor and Democratic strategist, Christina Cincin Ramirez, former Republican Congresswoman from Virginia, Barbara Comstock, and ABC News contributor and SiriusXM radio host, Mike Muse. Welcome in all. Christina, I do want to start with you, and I want to pick up where Asma and I left off when it came to Jamaal Bowman. Do you see this race as being somewhat of a bellwether for Democrats and progressives, and do moderates and progressives get along, or is this race a one-off in your view?
I think I agree more with Asma. This is really a more rare case. We also had AIPAC go in and try and unseat Summer Lee in Pennsylvania. They were unsuccessful. Jamaal Bowman was and has been more vulnerable. But I think ultimately AIPAC wants to show that they can win, but they're not necessarily going to win on the issue of Israel alone. If you look at what they're pouring in money for, it's really about other components, other issues. It isn't in their messaging about Israel and Palestine. And the truth, I think, also going back to this tension within the Democratic Party itself, is we have seen, especially amongst younger voters, that ultimately will decide the future on these core issues, a big move in favor of and more sympathy with the Palestinian cause, while still supporting Jewish people within Israel. So I think that long term, AIPAC really has 70% of Democrats saying, amongst young people saying they want a ceasefire. Those are hard numbers for AIPAC to combat long term.
Barbara, Christina invoked AIPAC, that pro-Israel lobbying group. Do you think if they are successful in unseating Bowman tonight because they are supporting his primary challenger, that they might go after other progressives in other districts?
Well, I think they've been a significant factor, but when you're trying to unseat an incumbent, there always has to be other problems. And so, Jamaal Bowman has had a lot of other problems, as was noted earlier. And this is a lot like Bob Good on the Republican side, who was an extreme, Freedom Caucus guy who just, he ended up having Donald Trump and Kevin McCarthy and a lot of his colleagues against him, too. Jamaal Bowman had Nancy Pelosi against him, as well as some of his colleagues, because he's just not a very good team player. So a lot of times, a lot of things gang up on you, and then AIPAC was there with the money to help, I think, put it over the edge. So I don't know that it really tells you a lot more than the fact that he wasn't very popular, just like Bob Good. But it's these extremists that are really, they drive people away, and then it catches up with them.
We could talk about Bob Good another time. I do think that Virginia race has still not been called yet. It's about 300 votes apart. Last I checked, it might be closer now. Mike Muse, I want to turn to you. When it comes to that Jamaal Bowman race, what is your reaction to the possibility that he gets unseated tonight, that he might become the first member of the squad to lose a primary? Do you think that this has a larger political impact than just in this district?
I actually think that it does. I think that if all polls are indicated that it will be a long night for Jamaal Bowman going forward. And if you think about the historic numbers of fundraising totals that have been poured into this campaign, it's one of the highest fundraising efforts of a congressional race to date. I do think that no matter how you sit on this side, that this is an issue that voters are thinking about, in particular the younger Democratic voting bloc. And And if you think about President Biden, he's going to need that entire coalition in order to win, because it will be done on the margins. And also, too, when I think about what Asma said correctly, I think about the suburbs of Detroit, thinking about Dearborn, that definitely is a more pro-Palestinian approach. And so I definitely do believe that Israel and the Hamas conflict will be top of voters' mind, in particular a Democratic coalition, that President Biden would need to try his best to keep everyone intact in order to win, because whoever wins between him and former President Trump, it will come down to the margins, in particular within the battleground states.
I have to apologize to our folks at home. I've been looking down because I keep checking my laptop because Barbara piqued my interest to see if that Bob Good race has been called yet. In my view, it has not, or excuse me, from what I've seen, it has not been called yet. That's that Republican primary in Virginia. Trump challenging one of the most conservative members in Congress to try to oust him. We can get into that again another time. LZ, I go back to Jamaal Bowman with you. Even if he pulls off an upset tonight, and certainly if he loses, is that a sign to progressive Democrats that being a member of the so-called squad might get you national political fame, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that the voters in your district, who are ultimately the ones that vote you in or out, support you?
Well, I don't know if we can make that kind of broad brush statement based upon what happens with this election, because there are a lot of extra factors coming into that formula that's influencing it that's you can't really replicate in other areas around the country. But what I will say this about the squad. There's this notion that if we don't all check yes, then there's somehow something's wrong with the unity of a particular party. And, that's not really how the Constitution was set up. It was set up for there to be challenges. And even though the forefathers weren't for political parties, they were for good discourse. And so I think just because you challenge the Biden administration and you're a Democrat, it doesn't mean you're not a good team player. It just means that you're pushing for the things that you were voted for. And his district did send him to office for the issues that he's fighting for. Remember what his district really looks like. Westchester is predominantly white, and that's predominantly where the money is coming from. But he also represents a lot of black and brown people who also were part of the coalition that sent it to Congress. And so I think we need to think about the entirety of what this race looks like and what the results may end up being. But it also needs to be singular, because they're in New York, and you really can't replicate that environment and what's going to happen on the end of that anywhere else in the country.
And he did campaign on the same messaging as it relates to Israel that he's saying now, back when he won the first time. LZ, Christina, Barbara, Mike, thank you all very much for your time. Keep your seats.